think we're lucky or just a terrible accident?
Oh, sweetheart, I think we're so lucky.
I think we're one great, big, giant smash-up.
Hello and welcome to the Lodgers Sordid Cinema's Twin Peaks podcast. My name is Simon Howell. I'm joined as always by Kate Redebaum.
Hello.
And last week I lied when I said that we had our last returning guest, because returning once again is the fabulous Mr. Byron Davies.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the show again.
Yay!
And it's another big one. It's another big week. Lots to discuss, lots to get into. Real quick before we launch into things, I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but we're actually the only Twin Peaks podcast on the internet. So if you think that's a worthy thing to be doing, you should rate and review us on iTunes. Otherwise, people may not hear about Twin Peaks. They may not know that it's happening. How will they know unless you promote us? Just throwing that out there. Anyway. Rates, reviews, they're all good. As you know, the show and therefore the podcast are wrapping up soon. But, the more people can hear us through time and, enjoy the nerdery, the better for everyone. We got so much to talk about, so we may as well just get into it. Part 15 of The Return. Perhaps the sweetest, saddest, and one of the most unsettling episodes of The Return yet. Although I guess that will remain to be seen as we go ahead and judge, and I'm once again sort of at a loss as to where to start. We may as well start with sort of the concept of fan service, or things that will make the fans happy, which, in a lot of series happens on an almost weekly basis. In theory, I'm thinking of, Game of Thrones, for instance. But it's been fairly elusive, perhaps purposely so, on The Return. However, this week we got pretty much what seems to be a bow on one of the series' very longest running sort of story arcs in terms of character and relationships. And I'm talking, of course, about Big Ed and Norma. And, of course, preceded by the scene with Nadine and her shovel and her confession. So, actually, I want to start with you, Byron. How did you feel about seeing in what's been like a pretty deliberately challenging and abstruse season, such an overt piece of, for lack of a better term, crowd pleasing?
I found it both cathartic and challenging. I don't think there are that many scenes of such catharsis in Lynch's work that I can really think of. Two that came to mind. One came to mind just because it's one that I always, I cried during this scene.
Byron, I was debating for this podcast, just recording myself sobbing and sending that in as a podcast. We'll see if I can be more coherent than that. But I've seen it now twice, and the sobbing happens throughout both episodes, so no shame about crying at all. Anyway, please continue.
Well, so I started thinking about what other scenes in Lynch's work I've cried during. One is in Mulholland Drive, in the Rebecca Del Rio's song Llorando, enormously cathartic scene, an enormous release. And the other is at the end of The Straight Story, interaction between Richard Farnsworth and Harry Dean Stanton. One thing that interests me about all three of these scenes is that there is some sort of interest in something external going on in all of them. That is, it's not as though the characters can just face each other and confess their love or be honest with each other. It has to be mediated by some additional factor. In the case of The Straight Story, it's the car, or rather the lawnmower. Harry Dean Stanton says, "Oh, you drove all the way in that lawnmower," and that's how the movie ends. As though their emotions can only be externalized or displaced onto an external object, and that's their way of communicating after being estranged for so many years. And similarly, in Mulholland Drive, the in the Club Silencio scene, it's mediated by something external, namely a scene of spectatorship, something going on a stage. Now, with this scene between Ed and Norma, there is also something external going on, namely the sale of the franchise. And so it's really interesting that this emotional change is predicated upon an economic transaction, that this economic transaction has to go forward before Ed and Norma's relationship can go forward. But the other thing, so that those were all of the things that I was thinking about and just trying to make sense of my own catharsis and my own crying during that scene. But it was also a very challenging scene in that not only are we teased a little bit, to think that things in fact aren't going to work out and Ed is going to end up heartbroken again. But there's even a question lingering even after the conclusion of the scene, because we have seen something like this with them before. Season 2 ends. There's a scene in season 2 where Ed and Norma are together to be married, and that's when Nadine recovers her memory. And so it raises these questions about how representative we're supposed to take these scenes, and how significant it is that in this series, the series can kind of play with an ambiguity between whether a scene is really a matter of dramatic progression or whether it's something just symptomatic of a larger repetition. Or so there is this question about whether this is something, because we have seen this happen or something like this happen between Ed and Norma before, and between Ed, Norma, and Nadine before, something roughly similar. It raises questions about whether this is something that they may perhaps go through every year or something like that.
Wait, Byron, are you trying to take our catharsis away from us?
Well,
God damn it, Byron. Let us have this.
Absolutely. But I guess this came to my mind in connection with other scenes in part 15 and related episodes, related parts, where this question of repetition and whether a supposed dramatic progression is really just a rehearsal or a repetition of something very common in the relationship, or symptomatic of something repetitive or stuck about a relationship, or questions like that are coming up. And of course, I'm thinking of something like the interactions between Audrey and Charlie, where you have this question of whether is this real? Is this really a dramatic progression? Or is it artificial? Is it the rehearsal of something? And I was even thinking of this in connection with the appearance of another Norma Desmond, in Sunset Boulevard later in the episode. And that this is really how Norma Desmond lives in the movie Sunset Boulevard. That her life really just consists of a series of rehearsals for a supposed comeback, and that and that even got me thinking that that the relationship between Audrey and Charlie is very similar to the relationship between Norma Desmond and Joe Gillis, William Holden's character in Sunset Boulevard, and also certainly Norma Desmond's relationship with Max, played by Eric von Stroheim, in Sunset Boulevard, where there's, again, the question of whether there's a real dramatic progression going on, or whether this is just rehearsals or others living according to a particular individual's fantasies. I don't at all want to tarnish, raise questions, too many questions about our feeling, the very real feeling of catharsis that we experience with Ed and Norma. But I do think it needs to be put in this broader context of what other kinds of relationships are we getting? What other sorts of portraits are we getting? And I think this is very important in understanding what kind of a series this is, because in the original series, we had something like a soap opera where dramatic progressions were real, at least in the sense of pushing a story forward, and a story that could, in principle, go on forever, as in principle soap opera could. Whereas here we're getting something much more contained.
Yeah.
We're getting something. We know that this ends. We know that this is going to end soon. That this world is going to be closed, at least for now, and so that means that the series, that Lynch can play with this ambiguity between actual dramatic progressions and something more like a portrait of a relationship, and also the idea that maybe what appears to be a dramatic progression is really just symptomatic of some sort of larger repetition or something that goes on all the time.
There's a lot of great stuff in what you just said. It'll probably take us a while to unpack all of it across the whole episode. But I think it's fascinating that you went right to this question of repetition, Byron, because this is the thing I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of many episodes, in terms of these questions of basically like duration and the feeling of time passing quite slowly in a lot of instances in The Return, the way Lynch is sort of amping that up on the one hand. But then on the other hand, these sort of very explicit nods to things like repetition, even in the explicit reuse of scenes. And so this is like, for me, I think you're absolutely right. This is like a defining tension in the new episodes. And one of the things I've been thinking about here is that really what is going on there is a sort of complex way in which Lynch and Frost are signaling the idea that time passing does not necessarily equal change or things improving or things freeing themselves from repetition, right? Like the idea of duration on its own doesn't necessarily produce different forms of life. And I think that this scene with Norma and Ed is like a really interesting example of that. But I think on the other side, I think what's interesting about what you point out, Byron, this question of whether or not this scene has happened before with Norma and Ed, or whether or not we're supposed to sort of think this is the final answer to this question, there will be no more change and they're going to be together forever or not. I think what's interesting about that is that my answer is it doesn't really matter. The idea that this might fade or it might go away or Nadine might come back and, get back in the mix or something, it doesn't really change any of the kind of like ecstatic effective quality of this scene. And there are so many things going on in this sequence that like I could talk about them a lot. This might be one of my favorite scenes in like the whole Lynch oeuvre, which is saying something. And I don't know, being sort of hit with this like incredible emotional punch right out of the gate for the episode was a disorienting way to start. And then it just gets more disorienting as we go forward. But like a couple of things I wanted to say about it, and then I want to hear what you think about it, Simon. A couple of things I wanted to say about it. I think it's really interesting, this question when Nadine shows up and is talking to Ed, if this is effectively the payoff of the Jacoby storyline with the shovel and like the podcast and all of this stuff, which for some reason I find to be hilarious. Like the idea that we've had so much Jacoby and this is the payoff. And I actually think it's like a really kind of beautiful payoff. The idea that like his kind of nonsense might translate into like an actual sort of emotional truth for someone, I found to be really interesting. That's the first one. The second thing that I find stunning about that sequence is like the use of the music is the Otis Redding song. And not just in the sense that it's like pure emotion, because it is that and it's amazing, but is again, the fact that Lynch is sort of modulating it so that it drops in and out, which mirrors the way that like they're playing with our expectations about whether this is going to happen or not. It's this sort of stopping and starting. But then even more than that, I love the idea that they use the live version of that song, because it's, as much as the music is present on the soundtrack, there's also this sort of idea of like clapping, and an unseen audience is present in the scene. And there is like this heartbreaking, beautiful way in which it's like the audience gets to be really part of like this moment between Norma and Ed. And I don't know, that like gets me as much as, Everett McGill's like voice cracking, or like that hand, like Norma's hand coming on his shoulder from out of frame. It's like, oh man, I will never be able to watch that sequence without like weeping.
So, two thoughts. One, I feel that we can't discuss this sequence without just acknowledging how sadly novel it is just to see like two septuagenarians making out on screen. Like it just does not happen in media ever. So like I just enjoyed that as like an aspect of representation. I also don't want to rob anyone of catharsis, but I had a thought during this sequence The use of the live version of I've Been Loving You Too Long, I mean, it works completely on the level that you mentioned, Kate, but I have to say what it immediately made me think of was the way the live version of What a Wonderful World was used in Lonely Souls. That made me think about Becky, whose fate is up in the air, and I can't have been the only one who needed to rewind and turn the closed captioning on for Caleb Landry Jones' scene, which maybe we can talk about later. But, there's certainly indications in this episode that she may no longer be for Twin Peaks / this world, although obviously death is somewhat is a somewhat ambiguous state in this universe sometimes. But the use of that live recording, that was one of my first thoughts, was this is both beautiful and, in context, incredibly ominous.
Well, there's something about like the intensity of the scene in and of itself. I think that like almost verges on the painful in, like in the sense of like ecstasy is, as again, I think I used this explanation when we were talking about the season 2 finale, but like the idea of ecstasy is like a loss of self, right? I mean, and here like Lynch kind of, thematizes that or like materializes that in this idea that like Ed and Norma like coming together, like explodes into this shot of this sort of mountain and then the sky and it's like the clouds moving and it's like it's not even them anymore. It's like just this sort of pure emotional state and like it's like it's derealizing, which is that the name for that term that I think it's like a psychological sort of not disease, but breakdown or something where it's like you lose track of who you are effectively. And it's like Lynch is like getting close to that. And then I hadn't really put together that idea, Simon, that like that might be sort of almost foreshadowing this loss of Becky, especially when you have these scenes of like Shelley sort of, joyfully kind of crying over Ed and Norma getting together. And so again, I definitely think that's there. That's a possibility. It's all mixed together. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think Becky's definitely a goner, but if it turns out to be that way, then I think this scene will be impossible to watch without that like being a huge pall over it.
I also, just because it was interesting reading about this, I noticed people, I think Joel Bacco was one of them, and then a few other people who had like very opposite reactions to this scene and found the scene to be more like maybe of the register where, like our guest Matt, how Matt felt about the little boy being run over by the truck sequence, in the sense of like it being not like, I don't know, ironic for lack of a better term, like that it is. It's not to be taken seriously. And they like weren't that crazy about it, actually. They felt like it kind of didn't do Ed and Norma justice. I feel like I'm not even equipped to like address that as a reaction because I feel the exact opposite. Like I feel like there could not have been a better scene for them. And I just brought it up because I think it's such a fascinating like example of how, how different reactions can be to things in general. But I think again, like how Lynch is how Twin Peaks is very good at like creating those kinds of spaces where you can have such variable reactions to sequences.
Well, I think that goes back to some old questions that have come up in the podcast over the course of my listening to it, namely whether Lynch's romanticism or apparent sincerity can ever be taken seriously given its apparently cynical context. And I think that you guys have been correct to say that no, in fact, these can work in equipoise. These can work together. That Lynch is, in fact, reflecting on something very real about human existence and the different perspectives that we can take on it. And that involves moving in both romantic and cynical spaces. And I think it's just not everyone watches him that way. But that's the way that I prefer to watch him, as walking in both spaces.
I will say that I hope that Becky is okay, not only because I like the character and the performance and because it would be very upsetting, but also because I feel as though if they're going to do something that affects, our core characters that deeply, I would prefer it to have happened with more time to go, more time to unpack it, more time to deal with it. But, this is, I don't want to drift too far into the speculative lane, so I'll just leave that there. But as long as we're talking about sort of open-heartedness and emotion and all these things, I guess the easiest segue to go to is to talk about the end of The Log Lady.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's just rip that Band-Aid off. Here, taking something that was sort of, I guess you could call it productive subtext, and making it text in a very pronounced way that I can't say I was expecting. And I really can't think of an instance where like a performer's death has been so not just organic, not just written into the text, but like so directly confronted and so directly woven in. If you think about how, long-running series or film series have to pivot around or work around, the deaths of major performers, it's always a bit of a ballet. You don't want to risk seeming exploitative, but you don't want to, ignore the audience's awareness. And here, there's none of that pussyfooting about, really. It's as direct a confrontation with that as you can possibly imagine. And, I had to pause for a moment to think about the production aspect, like the fact that when, I don't know for certain, but I'm assuming that when Michael Horace is sitting down to record the other end of that conversation, that she's already gone. And things like that are just so upsetting to me. But I'll be, in a productive way, I hope.
Well, yeah, I think that the stuff that you're picking up on there, like it all is of a piece and adds to and sort of like amplifies the emotional quality of that scene. I mean, it's interesting because this episode, like, we'll come back to it, but there was a ton of sort of, plot, like, development and possibly the development that everybody's been waiting for forever, which is like maybe Coop coming back, all these things. There was a lot that happened in this episode. And yet, like, everybody is talking about the Catherine Coulson scene and the Ed and Norma scene, which I think is something just should be remarked on in and of itself. The idea that, like, there is something going on that's so interesting and so strong with the emotional stuff here that it really kind of dwarfs, like, I don't know, the plot progression stuff or these other things. I think that's fabulous, and I think it's rare. But anyway, so that was one part of it. But what I was going to say about this, so this idea that, like, this knowledge of her death and, like, the documentary aspect of this is, like, images of this person who's actually dying right before our eyes, really does, like, amplify this sort of just pure sadness over this woman passing and over the character passing. I mean, we should mention the idea that, like, Lynch and Frost here do this double move of, like, they've already acknowledged the actress dying at the end of the pilot premiere there, and then now we're acknowledging the character passing, and, like, they're both given equal weight, which is fascinating. But I think, as you say there too, Simon, it's like there's something so unsettling about this idea that, like, you want to be in a space of mourning for her, and yet really this is like a very confrontational scene. And when the shots of Catherine Coulson first open, she's sort of looking off screen, like she's looking to the left, and the camera isn't sort of directly in front of her. But then towards the latter part of the conversation, when she's saying her final words, effectively the camera is framing her directly on. She's looking basically into the camera, and she's like kind of exclaiming that she's dying. Anyway, I wanted to say just like that, as you say, Simon, this is such a rare thing in, I don't know, particularly Western representations. I mean, this is maybe, again, like, maybe it's too facile to say this is like Lynch sort of, his ability to kind of live maybe beyond some of the Western strictures of thinking, or like his attraction to Eastern stuff. I think it's a bit simple to just put it that way. But anyway, like, representations of death are avoided basically at all costs in Western culture, right? I mean, this is the idea of, like, bodies that are dying being moved into hospitals where they don't have to be looked at. There's some, like, really fascinating writing by a woman named Vivian Sobchak, who's a film scholar, who's written a lot about, like, different kinds of ways that film handles representations of death. And she sort of talks about how, like, in Hollywood, there's, like, a proliferation of like, violence being done to bodies, and, like, the idea of, like, a threat to bodies, but the actual, like, death itself is never present, right? I mean, it's like, sure, bodies are destroyed, but death itself remains this thing that's, like, always just out of reach. And some of that has to do with the fact that those are fictional characters and we know they're not really dying. Whereas here, we see them dying. And when you were saying you couldn't really think of other examples of this, Simon, the only other example I am kind of aware of as a similar comparison is a film by Nicholas Ray called Lightning Over Water. Actually, maybe it's not by him. Maybe his wife got credit for it. I don't remember. But, like, Nicholas Ray, for people who don't know, is the director of Rebel Without a Cause and, like, a million other amazing things. He's like fantastic. He's so interesting. And then as he was dying, basically, he, like, makes this film with, it is his wife, right? Do you remember, Simon?
I think so, but don't quote me on it. But do quote Kate on it.
Yes, my fault if I'm wrong. But basically, it's like it's a sort of very odd thing where it's like them almost trying to film his death, like film the act of him dying in a very strange way, and it's a really interesting film. It's fascinating. Anyway, all just to say that like how rare this is. This is with Catherine Coulson. It's yet another example, I think, of like just how like special and radical a lot of what The Return is doing.
I think it's worth pointing out that Lynch, this is not new or unusual for Lynch either. He's done similar things in the past of casting ill actors and not not hiding or their illness, or even so much as incorporating their illness into the story in any explicit way. One example is the casting of Richard Pryor in Lost Highway.
Oh, yeah.
While he had multiple sclerosis at the end of his life. And also Richard Farnsworth in The Straight Story was dying of cancer during the filming of The Straight Story.
Although I thought he kept that to himself, although I could be wrong.
My understanding is that the reason why he had to walk with 2 canes was because his legs were weak from the cancer. My guess is that was a feature of that was something incorporated into the film that wasn't a part of the original story of Alvin Strait. It's evidently something that Lynch is on Lynch's mind a lot.
I don't know. It's hard to talk about that scene even. R.I.P. Catherine Coulson. She was amazing.
Moving on. We'll move into as per usual, the openly speculative portion of the program and talk about the adventures of Bad Coop at the convenience store. I have to say, I hate to repeat a joke to people, but I really loved Braunt's tweet about this, which was, convenience store disappeared, didn't seem very convenient to me. So we get, people were talking about the connections to Part 8 last week, but actually I thought this sequence connected, more directly and more forcefully to that than anything in last week's episode. And of course, we get Bad Coop actually going upstairs to the upper part of the convenience store, where Bob said that where Bob is supposedly from, where he grew up. And we finally meet Philip Jeffries, who is what exactly? Like a large kettle? I noticed some people calling him a tin machine, which, hardy har. What else do we think Jeffries might have been?
I have no idea. I have lots of things to say about that, but I don't know, Byron, do you have a take on the David Bowie tin kettle thing?
Oh, I like Tin Machine, but I had thoughts on Cooper in that scene, but not so much the whatever contraption Philip Jeffries is. I was impressed by the appearance of a radiator in the shot before, and so much of this and Part 8 and everything having to do with Part 8 seems to be lifted from the iconography of a Eraserhead. And it's something that had even occurred to me in the past in connection with the room above the convenience store, as it appears in Fire Walk with Me, that it seems to be a kind of descendant of Mary's family's house in Eraserhead. This kind of this very gloomy familial atmosphere, alternative familial atmosphere, and it's just I took it that the radiator was a kind of nod to that old iconography.
Since you mentioned Cooper in that scene, before I get to my serious point, another jokey one, which is that I just watched the new Wet Hot American Summer series.
Oh, we watched it too, yeah.
I couldn't help but connect Jeffries turning into a tin machine to H. John Benjamin turning into a can of vegetables. Totally facile, but anyway. To get back to Cooper, something that's fascinating about Bad Cooper in this sequence is that he finally seems to not be 10 steps ahead here.
Yeah.
He seems to be, as other people have noted, kind of in the more traditional Cooper position of trying to investigate and find answers, which is interesting considering this might be the episode in which Cooper comes back, which I'm sure is something we'll talk about later. But this whole time he's been very, he's really commanded every scene that he's in, and seems to like have, with the exception of certain information he's trying to find out, really like total command of what's happening. But here he finally seems to confront a force that he doesn't command, to the extent that he gets sort of matrixed out of the scene via payphone, or landline to payphone, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the main thing that I took away in relation to Cooper. There was this break, particularly at the end of the sequence, where the final time that he says, "Who is Judy?" he seems quite upset by not being able to figure this out, like quite threatened or something by it. And I don't know, there's a lot of interesting things in that scene with him. I mean, for one thing, this idea of like him, the show very sort of overtly playing with this idea that Evil Coop is now our hero in a certain kind of way, and has been all along. Like, he is the one who's sort of out doing things and making things happen, and is like the narrative driver, and is now literally stepping into the role of like the Twin Peaks fan that desperately wants to know who is Judy. I mean, I found this like a kind of a funny joke almost, this idea that like fans, 25 years ago when Fire Walk With Me came out, like picked up on this "Who is Judy" line. And again, as we've discussed, my brain does not particularly work on the kind of mythos level. And so like, I just sort of hear this line of like, "Who is Judy?" And I just think like, it's a non sequitur, like no big deal. But, people spend 25 years being like, we have to figure out who Judy is. And the idea that Evil Coop is like the one who's going to step in to find that answer. I found that quite, I don't know, strange or something, yeah.
Wait a second. Evil Cooper is the hero now because he beat the shit out of Richard Horne, which is like the most heroic thing you can do.
But yeah, no, this question of Judy, all of that stuff was great. I loved the line from Jeffries to Evil Coop when he asks about that sort of flashback to Fire Walk With Me, and Cooper says, "Yes, you mentioned Judy 25 years ago or whatever," and then Jeffrey says, "You are Coop." And like, that's a really interesting line. I mean, I think it's easy to just sort of blow by it, but I think it's interesting that like a moment is taken to sort of remind us here that like, again, things are not quite so simple as just like, this guy is like a bad thing that we can all just throw away and that we have no relationship to. It's like, as you already said, Simon, it's like in a certain sense, he is Coop, right? I mean, it's like he's part of Coop. And as much as we would like things to be this like clear binary between good and bad, it's like there's some interesting muddying of that going on here, which I quite liked.
That's exactly resonant with my experience of the scene. That it was a scene where Evil Cooper, the emphasis was on Cooper as opposed to evil, but with evil still there, and that comes out in the fact that also we learn that he shares continuity and memory with Cooper, the flashback to the scene with Fire Walk With Me is evidently a memory that Evil Cooper has, together with the distortions of memory, like the changed voice of Philip Jeffries, and also just in the very earnest way in which Evil Cooper is interrogating Philip Jeffries. It's very, very familiar to us from Good Cooper.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very true. I have another point, actually, that will lead us to the next scene, and I'll make in a few minutes. That's sort of, again, this like murky, breakdown, or like the murky way things are being explained or used in the return versus the old show. But before we move to the next thing, there was a couple of things I also wanted to mention here. I mean, we haven't even talked about like the amazing scene that is Evil Coop getting to the convenience store, going up the stairs, sort of blinking out of existence into this, quote, room above the convenience store, which... Right. Again, I find so funny as like almost this kind of like strange literalism of the return, like the way the return is making something so literal. Like I really never would have thought that like Lynch and Frost would have spent so much sort of time and energy and like world around the idea of there actually being a room above a convenience store, like where things were happening. I just didn't really think that was going to be a thing.
Well, it's literal, but it's also like there's a sense in which, because as he's moving through this convenience store, it seems like it's being intercut with the trees, right?
Yes,
and
yeah.
You almost get the feeling of like Twin Peaks is contained up there or something like that. Like there's some sort of bizarre like interspatial relationship that's not one-to-one that I just found fascinating.
This is my point, is about the woods. But let's go back to the woods, because I think there's some interesting stuff there we should talk about. But the other thing we haven't talked about yet is the fact that when Cooper gets into this upstairs space, it is the room from Fire Walk with Me that's in Laura's dream. Which again, Levy and I both kind of jumped when we realized that. It's such a, I don't know, stunning, unnerving image. This idea of again taking something that had been sort of this mental geography in Fire Walk with Me, which for fans who don't remember, this is when Laura is given a painting by Mrs. Tremont and told that it would look good in her room, and she puts it up on her wall, and then she has this totally uncanny dream sequence where she's sort of in the painting at one point. It's insane. It's amazing. Anyway, this idea of in The Return, taking what had been a kind of purely mental geography and making it physical, it's sort of it interestingly mirrors what's going on with, again, this idea of the convenience store itself being real. I didn't really think that convenience store was, again, going to be a physical material place that we could go to. And of course it's mushy, because at the end it sort of blinks out of existence, so maybe it's not. But, when we saw it in part 8, I didn't really think 50 years later, characters in The Return are going to be driving to the convenience store, right? So I don't know, again, there's something really fascinating there about this sort of taking mental stuff and making it physical and real, which is deeply strange and deeply unnerving. But I loved it. I love seeing that room.
And it's that sort of collision of the banal and the unreal, where it really is just a convenience store, but is it really just a convenience store?
Yeah. And the magical cut where he opens the door and he's in the gas station, or he's in the motel parking lot. I love that stuff. I mean, it's just, it's of course, just these are the things that cinema can do that other things can't do. But I just loved that, the door opening in the motel parking lot. I just thought that was great. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't know. But before we talk about the woods or anything, is there any of that stuff that you wanted to add to, Byron?
Only that I think that this surprise in the significance of the convenience store is maybe part of a larger phenomenon that we're finding in the progression of Twin Peaks up to now, but since the very beginning, that who knows what mere accident is going to be made permanent and significant. I mean, that's the surprise of learning how Bob was discovered, the accident of Frank Silva appearing in the mirror. And the reason why this is on my mind in connection with this scene is because of the recurrence of flickering lights throughout it, and how, as I understand it, though flickering lights had appeared in Lynch's work since Eraserhead, the flickering light above Laura Palmer's body in the pilot episode was a mere accident. That was just how the light was. And that was incorporated into the episode, and it became a part of the permanent Twin Peaks iconography. These flickering lights, and it just reminds me. I suppose it's inevitable whenever I'm talking about film that I'll come back to Stanley Cavell in some way, like I did when I was last on the podcast. But at the end of the second edition of The World Viewed, Cavell's first book on film, Cavell characterizes film, in contrast with the theater, film as accident made permanent. Film has this capacity to make permanent mere accidents in virtue of its just registering accidents and it's being an automatic medium in that kind of way. And there's a real awareness of that essence of film on Lynch's part, in the way that he can take mere accidents and not only make them permanent in the sense of they're being permanently registered on film, but having this grand significance, like the way that Frank Silva's appearance ended up in the mirror ended up having this grand significance, in the way that these flickering lights over Laura Palmer's body in the hospital or the mortuary had in the pilot, and and who knows? I mean, who knows what the origin of the reference to the convenience store was? Presumably, there was something very incidental and accidental about that. It's really been a series of surprises in this new series, a series of surprises in terms of what what is given significance and what not.
And speaking of having to figure things out on the fly and, what's shown isn't shown, what's important and not important, I found it fascinating, this decision to have this sequence, to have it happen between Steven and Gersten Hayward, characters, whom we had not associated in that way. And then to have that, first of all, we have to do like all these mental gymnastics to figure out like to catch us up to that, where that's not, this is absolutely not a mode of storytelling that we got from the original series.
Yeah.
Where you would just have a relationship like that, such as it is, sort of sprung on you out of nowhere, like 17 episodes in. That wasn't done. So like clearly we've been working in a very different register for a long time, but this is just another way in which it is different. In another way, it was just nice to see Alicia Witt get a little bit more to do, even if it's, mostly just a lot of whimpering and being groped by Caleb Landry Jones as he maybe kills himself. As I've said before on the podcast, and I've said before on other TV podcasts, if you don't see it happen, you really can't, put any stock in it. But so much is unsettling about that sequence. Not so unsettling is the apparent Mark Frost cameo that I just had to mention as the guy walking his dog. I didn't know that was him immediately, but it's one of those cameos where it's a cameo even if you don't know who it is. I didn't. Cute.
I didn't catch it until you get the close up of him talking to Carl Rod at the end. I was like, oh, Frost. But anyway, there's a lot going on in that scene. The stuff that I wanted to say about like the woods, which I think matters for the Gersten Hayward and Steven scene, because you don't go to them right away. You start off with this sort of like slow movement through the woods. You watch the guy walking his dog, and again, this follows right after the evil coop scene where we've had these like really, as you said, really interesting shots that sort of map the geography of the woods onto the convenience store, right? And this was the shot that I was talking about the previous week that I feel like I sort of randomly inserted into conversation, and I couldn't really understand, I couldn't really make a case for its significance, but I was like, there's something really interesting about this shot where Lynch is just sort of moving the camera through the air like 50 feet above the ground, and it's such an unusual and striking shot. And then I was like vindicated to see that it really does have some sort of like meaning within the larger universe of the show in this episode, which is, this really strange mapping through the movement of the convenience store space. Anyway, and in terms of like thinking about that question, like the woods and its relationship to something like this convenience store space, it was really interesting to me to think about what the woods has and hasn't been doing in the return, right? Because so much of like the original series operated around this idea of the woods as like being the bastion of evil, like this being the space where evil lived. And, there's something of the kind of like romantic in like the art history sense, not romantic in the lover sense, from Lynch in this regard, right? Like this kind of fascination and awe of nature, and like this idea that nature sort of dwarfs and undoes the human in a certain kind of way. And the woods in Twin Peaks always operated that way. What's been really interesting in the return is like, I find Lynch really playing up the idea of the woods, but like the evil and like this idea of the woods as a character, the woods as evil, is like an absent presence here. Like it's not real. We're still waiting for there to be any kind of like actual connection of the woods to any kind of like evil maldoing. I mean, we have the crazy stuff with Jerry Horn. There's been a few sequences here and there in the woods. Otherwise, I'm going to forget what they are now. But like, it's this, I don't know, I find it almost like an odd thing that we keep going back to the woods, expecting there to be something happening, and then there isn't. And then we have this scene where, like the quote evil in it is despair, and is like the crisis of like drug use and like life at its end and like meaninglessness. And I don't know. I mean, like, I think Lynch is doing something really interesting with like flipping that the quote mythology of the woods on its head. And instead we're being given something totally different as like the sort of pain and quote evil at the center of this space here. I don't really have like a ton to say about that scene other than just like, it was really hard to watch. It's really, it's very bleak. I find the two of them kind of amazing in it. I mean, I think, Alicia Witt does a lot with it, despite not having, maybe many lines. But the two of them together are like, It's so intense. It's like the inverse of Norma and Ed. It's like this, you're watching something that's like too intimate. It's like you're too close to this thing that you feel like you really just shouldn't be that close to. It's too much. Yeah.
Well, and the fact that he's talking like
this
is not helping.
It's like he's whispering in your ear, which is so gross and upsetting.
Yeah, the fact that he looks like, a version of young Brad Dourif that's dying, like, doesn't help.
Yeah. It's just such a painful kind of like, I don't know if this is the end. My guess is this won't be the end of this narrative, but like it's a painful moment in this arc that has been like a really important background arc in The Return, which is sort of tracing like, the existence of drugs like in the town and like what that is doing to people and how that's operating. And like, this is a hard moment to watch. Like this idea of like the bottom, and it's like whether Steven actually kills himself or not. It's like, you feel very much like you are at the bottom of something there. Yeah.
Byron, how did you feel? How are you feeling about The Woods? How did you feel about Kirsten and Steven?
I don't have anything specifically to say about The Woods, but with Kirsten and Steven, it's another instance of a portrait of a relationship, the sort I was talking about before, where, again, what we don't really know, because of the way things are presented and because of the nature of the series, that it will have a close, that that it can't just go on forever, that it has a determinate close in the way that the original series didn't. It's systematically ambiguous a lot of the time whether a portrait of a relationship is of the sort is one that's involving an actual dramatic progression, and the question of whether Steven really killed himself is a part of this, or whether it's the portrait of a particular instance of something symptomatic of that relationship. And this is really, I think, the way that relationships are being portrayed throughout the series, is that we just don't know what... And I think that the kinds of discussions typically of relationships that we get at the end of episodes at the Roadhouse is a part of this. We're meant to understand these portraits as representatives of something larger a lot of the time, as opposed to something that's actually moving a story along. And what's interesting and provocative about this scene is we don't know what is really going on, and it may never be answered. That's part of what's provocative and interesting about it. We may never know whether this is really moving a story about a relationship, or a relationship that implicates Becky in some way, or the rest of Twin Peaks in some way, or whether this is a portrait of, or whether this is just a portrait of a relationship at a particularly horrific moment.
To move out of The Woods, I mean, there's two major sequences left that I really want to talk about, and the first, I mean, is obvious. It's the Dougie sequence, and the main thing about that sequence that I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts on is, how do we feel about if this is... let's work on the assumption that this is the sequence that wakes Cooper up. Let's just say that. Because I think it's, it's certainly plausible, and the staging is grand enough. I wasn't sure if there was going to be staging grand enough for that to happen, but I think this qualifies. How do we feel about cinema or fiction or, this sort of visual representation being the engine for that liberation?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that is a great point. The idea that like it's a moment from Sunset Boulevard that wakes him up. I mean, I love the idea that it's like cinema and fiction becomes, this engine for like life-changing, like, world-shaking awakeness. I think that's great. I had been thinking about the Sunset Boulevard stuff, I don't know, maybe in connection again to like Lynch's, in the previous episode when Lynch, the character of Gordon Cole, like has the dream where he looks back at himself 25 years earlier. For me, it's like the Sunset Boulevard stuff almost functions that way here. It's like this idea of the past, literally, I mean, cinema's past, but then more explicitly, again, this idea of like Sunset Boulevard being the film that Lynch always sort of cites as his favorite film, the one film that people who like Lynch know that he likes and he will talk about. I don't know. There's something fascinating about like that being the film that he uses to wake Dougie up. And again, this sort of like really fascinating idea to explicitly reference what had been an implicit reference in the original show, which was calling David Lynch's character Gordon Cole was a reference to David Lynch's love of Sunset Boulevard. And then here that's just sort of blurred into this thing where it's all part of the same world. I don't know. I thought all of that was like lovely, wonderful.
I think it's interesting that when there have been references to the real world, with the notable exception of The Dream with Monica Bellucci, they have often been to features of the pop culture, but the broader culture of the sort that Lynch would have received in his early childhood. So the culture of the late 40s and early 50s. And I'm thinking of the role of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Part 8, and the broader significance of nuclear weapons in the series. And so it's very interesting that yet again we're getting something must have been significant to Lynch from childhood, and that it is a film about aging.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, just like Dougie, this appearance of Sunset Boulevard set off a whole bunch of free associations for me that I'm not sure if I can present them in any clear or systematic way. But I was, of course, thinking about the character of Gordon Cole in Sunset Boulevard, a movie producer, and all of the metatextual things that are involved in that, and how in the scene Norma says, "Oh, the team is back together. The old team is back together," just like a comeback. And then, but then how actually the old team is not back together, or at least not back together in the way that she thinks, because Gordon Cole just wants Norma Desmond's car. And so he in fact does not want to make a movie with her, and so there's this divorce between her understanding of the situation and that of the understanding of the rest of the world, and in fact that's actually another inverse of the situation for Big Ed and Norma at the beginning of the episode, where just in that. At the beginning of the episode, we're led to believe that Big Ed has this, is suffering from a similar kind of divorce between his perception of things and reality, with this disappointment and Norma saying, "Oh, I've got to talk to this guy," but that's resolved, and whereas, as we know, for Norma Desmond, that is not resolved. That divorce between her perception and reality is, runs to the heart of that film. So I was also thinking of other ways in which it's kind of unusual for Lynch to have these explicit pop culture references. I mean, we do get it, of course, in Wild at Heart. Some of that comes from Barry Gifford's novel. Like I believe the Elvis stuff comes from that, but the Wizard of Oz stuff, I believe, was Lynch's own introduction to that film. And I was thinking of just, I mean, it is part of what's so striking in that scene. I think it's very different from the way that pop culture references might appear in other sort of otherworldly or surrealistic films or contexts. I was thinking of the way that pop culture references work in the films of Yorgos Lanthimos, like the references to Rocky and in Dogtooth and Stand By Me and The Lobster, where that has the effect of almost sort of establishing a continuity between another world and ours, as though they're connected by like a kind of pneumatic tube of pop culture references, or suggesting maybe along more science fiction lines that this is indeed our world, but it has changed in some fundamental way. In the case of The Lobster, whereas with Lynch, it seems that the pop culture references, and this is certainly the case with the Monica Bellucci stuff, it operates more like dream material, and that's part of why it's so significant that some of this stuff comes from the culture of the late 1940s and early 1950s. This is the dream material going back to his childhood, in a lot of these cases.
I also think it's significant and neat that, if we think about some of the other things, actually basically all the other things that have seemed to kind of spark Dougie's / Cooper's interest, if you think about the old boxing poster, if you think about the statue, if you think about even like the high heels and the cherry pie, these are all very, 1950s or earlier sort of Americana imagery. So it kind of makes sense that a film from that era, I mean, yes, obviously it has other more obvious direct connections like the name Gordon Cole, but it makes sense to me that would sort of, if this is indeed the culmination of those sparks, I think that fits in a lot of very sensible ways.
The cameo of a sort that we get from J. Edgar Hoover on the wall of the FBI might operate in similar terms. It's as though I was reminded of this when Kate said that just because time has passed does not mean that there's been any progress. The fact that I have no idea whether FBI agents' offices in fact have portraits of J. Edgar Hoover on them, but it's nevertheless a really startling choice in this context. Again, a figure from that era representing exactly what defenders of the FBI want to whitewash, except when they're going so far as to whitewash J. Edgar Hoover. It's just very interesting that that's explicitly placed there, as though not even really making a political remark, but rather more just part of the dream material of David Lynch, that this is what the FBI signifies for him.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of like the signifiers of various times, which we've also mentioned here as well in relation to like Audrey and Charlie's house. We haven't talked about the Audrey and Charlie scene here yet either, which should be like the most important example of how time can be passing but nothing can be changing, right? Like they are just stuck in this. I've heard people talk about like Sartre and No Exit, or Buñuel and like The Exterminating Angel. It's like there is something that they are just not able to get out of what is going on with them. Anyway, so the idea that like that house has these sort of 40s, 50s signifiers. There's something interesting here too about how some of this, the kind of confusion of the presence of different times in the set design and the signifiers. It maps interestingly onto the formal strategies that Lynch is using around simply not letting us know what time we're in most of the time. I think you mentioned something about this, Simon, in relation to like Gersten and Steven, where we're just sort of in the middle of this all of a sudden. We have to like try to do mental math to figure out where we are and how we got here and what time we could possibly be in. And like the other example of this that people talked about a lot after this episode was the idea that we see Evil Coop text Las Vegas ? After he beats up Richard Horne. And, people have been like, oh, this is when he texts Diane, and that was 7 episodes ago, and it's such this big deal that we're getting this now, and like, can you believe this? And my first thought was actually like, are we sure that these are the same text messages? Like, why couldn't it just be that Coop is texting her again about it? Because he asked her about it once, and her answer was, they haven't asked me yet. So he could be asking her again. But like, it doesn't really matter. The point is that again, it's just about this stuff about the timelines and like Lynch purposely repeating things and purposefully confusing things is like yet another of his sort of tools to kind of unmoor us and put us in that constant position of not exactly knowing what's going on and where we are, which is, again, a very different position than what most like television and film strive to put you in, which is like a position of unquestioned mastery, where you're always in charge and you always know what's going on and all information is being carefully like coded and delivered to you, so you never have to have a moment of like even mild upset. And that's even true of like puzzle box films, where you know that there's some grand intelligence behind it that's going to get you there in the end. And with Lynch, it's the opposite of that. It's like you are having to grapple with a world that just at its core doesn't make sense always, which is, let's be honest, has a lot more to do with like the world that we actually live in than the other version. But anyway,
as much as I'm kind of dreading it, I'm also sort of looking forward to, when this is over, the inevitable attempts by superfans to make like Gantt charts or whatever that like chronologically order everything that's happening by universe or whatever.
I've already seen a version of that. I've seen,
Oh, really?
I think the Time for Cakes and Ale podcast people made one. And like I looked through it and it was interesting. And you know, to their credit, they did a lot of work on it, and they also acknowledged like it has mistakes in it. It's not full, all of that stuff. But it was interesting looking at it for me, how much I disagreed with a lot of what they put where. And all that did was really prove again this idea that like the show is simply not giving you enough information to like piece things together in an obvious way. It's like you can make claims as to like what the chart should look like, but the show isn't giving you enough to allow you to do that with certainty, which I thought was fascinating.
I was thinking about when Kate said that some people had been comparing the Audrey and Charlie scenes to Sartre's No Exit and Buñuel's The Exterminating Angel. I thought at first I nodded like, okay, yeah, that's good. But in fact, that those comparisons understate the strangeness of these scenes, because in that play and that film, at least we're given some sort of entrance into these spaces. We're given some sort of story about, or at least we see characters entering those spaces, and then they can't leave. But with Audrey and Charlie, we don't even see the entrance. We're thrown in there in a sense, with them. And so I think that comparisons that would come to mind more along those lines would be Beckett, especially Endgame.
Yeah.
And as far as films, one recent example of this kind of thing that I liked quite a bit was The Duke of Burgundy by Peter Strickland, where and there again there's the question of, you have the systematic ambiguity about whether something is really a dramatic progression or just the repetition or part of a rehearsal or mere artifice or something like that.
That's a good comparison, actually.
Yeah, that Audrey and Charlie scene this week, it's like I don't have as much to say about it, just because it almost feels very much like we've gone back to where we were in the first scene. Like last week's, it seemed like something new was coming out of it, or something different was happening, but instead now it's like maybe again just this drift towards violence, right? That it ends with Audrey attacking Charlie, but there isn't. Yeah, it's interesting how much Lynch is able to like make things unfold and move, like have the appearance of progression, but really there is no progression. It's kind of fascinating, actually.
The last sequence we should really talk about is in fact the last sequence of the episode, and our weekly or nearly weekly Roadhouse sequence, where, full disclosure, when I saw the full cast list come out, my one thing was I was dreading the Charlene Yee appearance for no really good like logical reason, except that I really, really hated Paper Hearts. I think that's an absolutely garbage little movie. But that was really the last time I could think of even having seen her in anything. Totally not fair, but it's where my head went. And I know other people are dreading the Eddie Vedder appearance, but full disclosure, I like Pearl Jam, so it's fine for me. Sorry, I'm gonna be that guy anyway. And I have to say, I think it was not only because my expectations were very low, that everything about that sequence, from the way that the Veil song Axolotl is folded in, and then Charlene Yee's performance, the way that her smallness is used in relation to these, comparatively lumbering guys who literally just, it's almost a relief when all they do is lift her and remove her from the booth. And then that crawl, and then of course that scream, and the way it climaxes with the track is just, man, this was actually quite possibly my favorite concluding sequence to one of these episodes so far.
Oh yeah, I think this might have been my favorite. I don't know. I mean, the road sweeping one that ends with Cooper staring at the statue is pretty great too. But this one is like really something, and it's been interesting to again watch people sort of try to like parse it on the internet. And as Simon and Byron saw this earlier too, there is a YouTube video that's now been made that compares the Charlene Yee sequence with the Coop crawling towards the light socket, the plug-in sequence. And, you know, and like certainly I think this person just sort of matched the screens up and then, you know, edited it, like worked them backwards so that you can see how similar they are. And there is something quite uncanny about like how closely they map onto each other particularly when the scream kicks in. I think there's something to that. I'm less interested in maybe the literal ideas that people have been taking out of that, which is like bodies in Twin Peaks are sort of being forced to enact things that are happening in Las Vegas or something. I didn't buy that so much, but what I really loved about the Charlene Yee sequence is like, it's kind of, I don't know, like the emotional climax of this episode where I don't know about you guys, but like I felt pretty battered by the end of this episode. Like I felt like I had been really like put through the ringer, and not all in a bad way. I mean, that's sort of the thing when they call it a roller coaster. You start off high before you go low, right? I mean, I felt very thrown around, like very upset really by the end of it. And then we get this scene in the Roadhouse. And like, as you say, Simon, there's something about Charlene Yee's like physical appearance where she's already quite small. And then the way that they put her on the floor with the folded legs, she becomes like a child. Like she looks very much like a child, a little kid. And then when she starts crawling and she's amidst this like forest of like adult legs and she's like weeping and looking down at the ground, and she doesn't seem to even sort of have enough awareness to be able to like look after herself or like to figure out what is happening to her. I don't know. I found it like a perfect summary of like all of the kind of feelings that you're left with throughout the episode, which is like terror and like helplessness and this sense of being moved like against our will, right? Like being taken somewhere where we don't know where we're going, and then particularly after the Catherine Coulson scene, like almost a sort of rage, like the rage that's part of grief, right? The idea of like fury that this could happen, that we could lose someone like her, and that time has to take people away from us. And like, for me, I just think that the Charlene Yee sequence like does all of that beautifully. For me, I don't need it to be part of anything. I just loved it on its own.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add is that it was quite refreshing to have the music so folded into the fabric of the sequence and not just be background, not just be, credit stuff. I mean, not to, those sequences are fine, but to have it actually be part of the emotional register of a sequence was really refreshing.
I thought it was terrific. One thing that I immediately thought of in connection with her screams were the screams of Laura Palmer. And the very similar punctuated screams Laura Palmer has in Beyond Life and Death episode in the Red Room. And so I was thinking of the ways and ways in which Laura Palmer can be representative of other kinds of trauma beyond her own, and particularly the trauma of women. And also in connection with this, her mother, Sarah Palmer, also being subjected to harassment by a biker. And in each case, we have some kind of disassociation where I mean, in your guys' podcast discussing the scene with Sarah Palmer, you were talking about whether Sarah was feigning her screams or whether it was some kind of ruse.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that wouldn't be the question that I would ask. It's rather, or rather, I would want the emphasis to be on the way in which, I would prefer the emphasis to be on the way in which disassociation, delayed reactions, not screaming right away, but only, after several moments are among how that kind of disassociation is very characteristic of trauma and the long-term effects of trauma. And so we certainly see this with Charlene Yee in the Roadhouse. I think we can characterize Sarah Palmer's screams in the bar in the previous episode in similar terms, and it's something that we've seen several times in the past in previous iterations of Twin Peaks with Laura Palmer. For example, her delayed reaction when Annie Blackburn appears in her bed in Fire Walk with Me. And there's something, of course, unnerving and uncanny about these, but also very real and very realistic. It seems strange to characterize Sarah Palmer's reaction to the biker in the previous episode as realistic, but I think that there's a very realistic depiction of the disassociation involved in trauma in each of these instances. And it's just another way in which, again, Laura Palmer ends up having this broader significance. Her trauma has this broader significance that maybe we didn't know, or we didn't that it really is the task of one of the tasks of the current series to bring out. And I was also thinking, I don't know what else to say about this other than we had a murder of a young woman in the news recently, broadcast in a video depicting a world very, very much continuous with the world of Twin Peaks in many ways, namely the murder of Heather Heyer. It's sort of just an accident of circumstance that Laura Palmer and the kind of the trauma that she represents could have that broader significance.
I was also thinking of the body that was just found in off the coast of Denmark with the submarine, which is like another very odd story about a woman being murdered. But anyway, I think all of that is really interesting. I hadn't thought about this idea of like the way in which kind of delayed reactions work in Twin Peaks and Lynch generally, and I think all of that is like really spot on. I like the idea of like the Charlene Yee sequence almost being something like a very delayed reaction to other things happening in the episode, or like an echo of a reaction. All of that. And then I think we probably should wrap up. So the last couple of things I'll just throw out there really quickly is the Roadhouse sequence in the middle, where James and the British guy go to the Roadhouse was like one of the truly weirder parts of this episode, where we get the like ZZ Top song playing and like people dancing with like zooming cameras, all very strange. I found it really interesting that like James himself, like the show is very straightforward about it. I found James quite creepy in that scene. Like the way that he talks to the woman is creepy. And like, maybe we're not supposed to think that. Maybe you could think, oh, James is just this nice guy and he doesn't understand what's happening. But like, I don't know. There's something interesting about the way in which the show like gives credence to her perspective as like this woman who doesn't really want to be bothered by him. And it's like, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. And then of course it explodes into this like much more extreme violence than would ever be possibly reasonable in response to any of that. I was kind of interested to hear about how you felt, Simon, about the green glove punching guy in that scene. I wasn't crazy about it. I'm maybe starting to share some of your concerns about like what they're going to do with him. The last weirdo thing I'll say is that the guy who played Renee's husband there, I was like, who is that guy? Is he just sort of like a Stephen Dorff lookalike? And then somebody, I think Keith Ulick, pointed out that he's the actor who, in the X-Files episode, where Scully has like the one night stand with the guy who has the tattoo that has Jodie Foster's voice, that was him. And I was like, holy crap, that guy does not look like he has aged 20 years in between those two episodes. Wow. But anyway, so there's that. We had the great like Stan Rizzo sequence again at the FBI. We had a little more of that. We had Chantel and Hutch with their kind of like philosophizing about like their sort of violence and murdering in relation to like the state of America, which I think is a scene that is going to get left out in most discussions of it, but I actually thought was quite fascinating. Like the idea of like them positioning their own sort of like murderous behavior in relation to like the genocide that founded America. It's like maybe it's all a little too heavy-handed, but I thought it was interesting. Anyway, so those were just the last two things I wanted to get on. Oh, and also the Duncan Todd being killed scene. Yes. Chantel coming
Patrick
in and
Fischler.
Exactly. The only thing I would have to say about that scene that I thought was fascinating was again that Lynch still is able to find ways to like disorient and surprise me as a viewer in terms of like staging a murder scene. All of that caught me really off guard. Like the way that her shoulder just comes into the frame out of nowhere and like blows their heads off was like crazy. Anyway, those are the last things I wanted to get on the table.
The only thing I really want to say about the James sequence is that I find it funny that they lock him up again, even though he clearly didn't do anything. Not really. I mean, the other guy did all the punching. He was just there, but he just gets arrested on principle. God damn it, James.
I also am wondering if we're ever going to get a James and Ed and Big Ed scene, because it's like he's his uncle. We haven't had any of that either, which is interesting.
That's true. Well, there's also no mention of Annie when the concept of family is discussed, which was a little. Oh, poor Annie.
Sad Annie. But Byron, did you have any last things you wanted to get on the table?
Just a couple things. One was I did like or there was something about the. I've mentioned. I said that there's quite a bit in the current series that seems to lift directly from Eraserhead. But one thing that occurred to me in connection with the FBI office in Las Vegas is how much that the FBI agent yelling Wilson is just like, it seems to be a descendant of the boss in the pencil factory in Eraserhead, yelling, "Hey, Paul," and how much that is also kind of a repetition of a kind of Hollywood type of the kind of pop culture that Lynch would have been raised on in the late 40s, early 50s, of the overbearing half of a comedy duo like a Bud Abbott or Jackie Gleason kind of thing. And it was just interesting, again, and it was just interesting how, again, Las Vegas, the Las Vegas scenes are the site for sitcom types. And I guess in connection with Las Vegas and Dougie, I was struck by the way that he particularly lingers over true in his repetitions of what Jamie E says. That I suppose that's the last thing he says before turning on the TV is the word true, and it's kind of lingering like a mantra. And I do think that Dougie's repetitions might be seen in connection with mantras of in transcendental meditation. Not that I have a deep acquaintance with that topic, but it's something. But the lingering effects of words seems important there, like in case of mantras, and also Dougie as himself something like a measure of truth. Like back when he interjected in the meeting, saying, he's lying, whatever Tom Sizemore's character was saying, it seemed important, but for reasons that I'm still trying to figure out.
Yeah. like many things, all of us still in a state of slight confusion about things. Yeah.
Perhaps my only regret about this podcast is that we didn't find, or really didn't make an effort to find, someone who is an expert in like Buddhism and or TM to help tease out some of those connections, because I think we're all sort of grasping in the dark when it comes to that stuff. But what's life without a regret or two? Anyway, thank you for joining us, Byron. Where can people find you online if they want to go harass you about this stuff?
Well, I suppose Instagram is fine. Byron9619. Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to listen to the show.
Aww, that's nice, Byron. Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yes, and for anyone who is hungry for more content, we are recording another Sorted Cinema this week. That's myself and former guest of this show, Ricky D, and our pals, where we talk about other film stuff. This week, we're actually recording it immediately after this podcast. We're going to be talking about the Safdie brothers' Good Time.
Oh, you've seen it. Stuff. I haven't seen it yet. I want to see it soon.
Well, you're going to have to hear the episode to hear how we felt about it. And we're going to talk about some other stuff too. Do check that out on over on sortedcinema.com as well. And you can find Kate on Twitter at Cinnament. That's CINEMENT. And you can find me on Twitter at HollowMind, spelled like it sounds. And that's about it for us. Thank you all so much for listening. We will be back with the penultimate episode next week.
Clean shirt, new shoes. I don't know where I'm going to. Silk suit, black tie. I don't need a reason why they come running just as fast as they can. Every girl is crazy about a sharp-dressed man. Gold watch, diamond ring. I am needing not a single thing. Cufflinks, stick pin. When I go out, I'ma do you in. They come running just as fast as they can. Every girl is crazy about a sharp-dressed man.